I can tell you this, that my goal, and I think that a lot of people have conversations about hot topics, hot button issues, but there are very few people who have conversations with others about faith. And particularly within the Jewish community, faith encompasses so much of identity and ethnicity, and in this case, politics, that we have conversations, but we don't always get the depth and the context. And so the goal is to have a conversation with you where nobody's vilified, where you're able to share your perspective and then give insights that maybe people don't know about. We are pleased to welcome to One Nation Under God, Bethany Mandel. She is a mom of 6 kids, an author, and a journalist. And we want to welcome you to talk about something that many people have been hearing about on the news and seeing on their feed on X, but maybe need a little bit more context around. And that is the decision by the Democratic Party to choose Tim Walz instead of Josh Shapiro, and then accusations of anti-Semitism. So before we get into this very potentially complicated topic, I just want to ask you about your own journey. So you're a mom of 6. You co-authored a book, and it was Stolen Youth: How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. So people could take that title and they could already make a lot of assumptions about your political leanings. And I think a lot of people have seen more conversations about that term, indoctrination, especially since the college protests that were sparked all around the country. So, in terms of the Jewish community in America in 2024, what would you say has happened since October 7th? Was there always a divide where you had a large majority of Jews in America who were considering themselves progressive or Democrat, and then a small minority that's Republican, and now that's more 50-50? Like, what has been your insight?
So, if you look at an electoral map from the last 2 elections, but especially the last one, if you look at New Jersey in particular, there are pockets of ultra Orthodox communities, the biggest of which is like Toms River, Lakewood area, which is in Ocean County. Those were deep, deep, deep red. It generally, and I think that this is probably standard across, religious communities, not just the Jewish community. The more right wing you are religiously, the more right wing you are politically, and so that aligns very closely. There's a lot of folks on the Upper West Side who are less religiously observant, and they tend to skew more leftwards. And if you are more visibly Jewish, generally you skew more rightwards.
And so in this country, is there a big divide still, even after the response of the Biden administration? Or have you noticed, either anecdotally or by any statistics from the Anti-Defamation League, that more Jewish voters are actually considering voting Republican as opposed to Democrat, in particular because of the response of this White House?
Yeah. So I will say, especially in the beginning of the war, I think that the overall consensus of the Jewish community, right or left, was more or less happy with how the Biden administration was handling, especially the immediate aftermath of October 7th. Over the course of the last few months, we've kind of seen a pulling back of that support. And so there is not as much appreciation for the Biden administration's support of Israel over the last few months. There has been a lot of frustration on the part of Israelis that I've heard, that they feel like they're handcuffed and can't take preemptive action against Iran. We're sitting here on Thursday morning, and we're sort of just waiting and watching as the world thinks about, should they clear the airspace? Should people leave Lebanon? Should people leave the airspace in Iran? How close should you be to a bomb shelter if you're in Israel? And so all of these questions are being asked. But I think in Israel, the question is ultimately, is the Biden administration preventing Israel from taking preemptive action that could be life-saving for thousands of Jews in Israel? And I think that there is a sense that is happening. Um, I think that everyone's political camps, right and left, are pretty static. They're not really moving that much. What I think is happening, if you look at the poll numbers of Jews in New York State, for example, Trump is actually leading. I think it's 53%, which is really significant in New York when you consider, the sort of Seinfeld stereotype of Upper West Side, more assimilated Jews. What I think is happening in New York is there is a level of political engagement among right wing Jews that didn't really exist prior to the last governor's race. The last governor's race was really interesting because Lee Zeldin carried an enthusiasm the likes of which no one has ever seen in New York State. And I've spoken to Lee Zeldin about this, and he said, they love me there. It's crazy. It's wild. There were parades down the streets in Brooklyn, in Orthodox Brooklyn, about him. And he came very close to winning as a Republican as governor in New York. And I think that what we're seeing is a realization on the part of right wing Jews that they have to become more politically involved and they have to be more engaged. And so the poll numbers that we're seeing are more of a manifestation of that versus a shifting rightward of a group of people, which I mean, I think is happening, but it's perhaps not as significant as people on the right might hope that it is.
So let's bring all of us to bear with this conversation regarding Kamala Harris. She just announced her VP pick, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. There were a lot of people presuming that she would pick Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, a very observant Jew, a pro-Israeli Jew. But you posted something on X and you said, I guess you can't be on the Democratic presidential ticket and also a Jew in 2024. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it was all indications. I mean, there was even a promotional video that was released accidentally by the mayor of Philadelphia announcing Josh Shapiro as governor preemptively. And so there was every indication that he was going to be chosen. And a lot of people replied to that tweet saying, Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders, as if to say that Jews being at the top of the Democratic Party is proof that there's no way that that's not why Josh Shapiro was chosen. Josh Shapiro is different from Chuck Schumer and Bernie Sanders in that, as you said, he has a very strong Jewish faith. And what I found really interesting in the wake of him getting passed over for the vice presidential slot was that he gave a stump speech basically for Kamala Harris. And he had this really impactful moment where he looked straight into the camera. And you could tell he was really sending a message. And he said, I'm proud of my faith. That's not something you do unless someone is telling you that it became a liability. In the day or two prior to him getting passed over, he tried to distance himself from past remarks that he had made when he was 20 years old in a school newspaper that were pro-Israel and cast doubt on the possibility of a two-state solution and the feasibility of a two-state solution. And he distanced himself from that. And I think a lot of Jews, myself included, saw that distancing as a mandatory part of him becoming palatable enough to sit on the top of the Democratic ticket. And, as a Republican and as someone who probably voting for Trump, but I'm definitely hoping he wins, I was disturbed that he wasn't chosen because I think that that's a bad sign for the future of the Democratic Party. That being said, I think that the ticket is less strong without him. I think that he was an obvious pick because he is so well liked in Philadelphia, so well liked in Pennsylvania, and that is such an important swing state. And I thought that was a real miss on the part of Kamala Harris. And the only explanation I can see is his past history of being pro-Israel. But what I also thought was interesting was that if you have sort of a chart of all the statements he's made in comparison to Tim Walz, they're not that dissimilar. They are pretty equally supportive of Israel. And I think the difference was that Shapiro was Jewish and that Walz wasn't.
So would you consider him being left off the ticket a snub, a strategic move, or anti-Semitism?
I mean, I think all three, but I think much more so a strategic move that is a manifestation of where I think the Democratic Party is going. And as a Jew in America, I'm disturbed by it, no matter if it's my party or not. It has become a liability to be a Zionist among many Democrats. I think that they're looking at the numbers in Michigan of folks who stayed home, who decided to vote uncommitted, and they decided, those are votes that we're not willing to risk if we have a Shapiro on the ticket. Joseph Lieberman ran with Al Gore, and that was an incredible campaign to watch for American Jews. I remember being a kid watching it and thinking, oh my God, anything is possible if a Sabbath observant Jew can be on a presidential ticket. And it would have been exciting as a mom to show my kids, there's this proud Jew on the Democratic ticket, but ultimately it looks like that that status of being a proud Jew became a liability for him.
Well, and we've seen so many different conversations happening, outside of the dinner table and more on media outlets and social media of groups that were opposed to someone being pro Israel, particularly because of what they see as militaristic cruelty against the children, against these people who've been displaced in Gaza. JD Vance saying it more pointedly, the presidential running mate for the GOP, saying Kamala Harris is caving to the Hamas wing of her own party. What do you say to those who are blatantly anti Israel because of how they say the government and the military is targeting citizens in Gaza? And do you think that Vice President Harris is caving to pressure, quite frankly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she has always skewed more left wing, and I think that she's willing to buy into a narrative that is not accurate. Israel, the military, if you read the research that John Spencer has done at the West Point Academy, he's the expert in urban warfare, which is what is happening in Gaza. It's urban warfare. Or if you talk to individual soldiers, I'm friends with many IDF soldiers, and the frustration that they feel is that they are being forced to go from home to home and do much more dangerous military action because they are being told we can't just bomb a building. We have to go from building to building, from room to room. And that is risking the lives of thousands of IDF soldiers because they're going into rooms that are booby trapped, bedrooms, children's rooms have tunnels underneath the beds. This is the kind of urban warfare that Israel is facing, but ultimately they have to face it. They had to go into Gaza. This was not a war that Israel asked for. It started on October 7th because of a massacre, the likes of which the Jewish people have not seen since the Holocaust. And they had to go into Gaza and take out Hamas so that something like this could never happen. There are still Israeli children being held hostage in the tunnels in Gaza 10 months later. October 7th was 10 months ago. We have 5 Americans who are presumed to be alive being held captive. I've never heard the vice president say their names publicly, which is a source of extreme frustration for a lot of Jews in America. But there's also 115 other souls, including children, including women, 10 months. I mean, you do the math. There have been so many reports about sexual violence that have been committed against women on October 7th, and these young women have been held now for 10 months. And so there is a lot of fear on the part of the Israeli public that they need to do what's right for these citizens that are still being held captive and held hostage by the most brutal totalitarian Islamist people that exist on the planet. This was an ISIS level attack, and they need to be responsible to those citizens to bring them back. And they've done so successfully in several operations, but those operations are extremely dangerous and extremely sensitive, and they can't bring back 115 people. And so this is not a situation that happened in a vacuum. And I think there's a frustration on the part of a lot of American Jews that the vice president doesn't talk enough about the hostages, for example, when she talks about ceasefire.
Well, and I want to continue to speak about the Shapiro conversation, Kamala Harris, the vice president, going with Tim Walz. But since you mentioned the hostages, we know sadly that the last a hostage who was unaccounted for, who we weren't sure of her location, whether she was dead or alive, has now been identified as sadly dead by the Israeli government. And do you think that Kamala Harris, President Biden, did they do enough to urge for the release of those hostages with the Qatari negotiators, with all of the parties involved?
I don't think so. I mean, the Qataris are still being very kind hosts to the Hamas leadership. There was a lot of pressure that they could have put on the Qataris. When the administration talks about the Qataris, they talk about them as partners in these hostage negotiation conversations. But the reality is they hold the cards, and there's so much pressure that could be exerted. And I will say, I have personal relationships with a lot of these families whose loved ones are being held hostage, and they do feel that especially the ones who have American citizens being held hostage, that the Biden administration has been a lot more communicative and a lot more empathetic with them and to them than the Netanyahu government. And that being said, I don't think that the Biden administration is doing enough. President Biden has only mentioned any of those hostages by name once. Hersh Goldberg Poland, he was born in California. He spent time in Chicago. His parents were born in Chicago. He spent time in Richmond, Virginia before his family moved to Israel. He's an American citizen. And his parents joke that his Hebrew actually isn't even that great. But he has only been mentioned once by the president, and it was in a Rose Garden address where Hersh's parents were present, and the president bungled his name and then thought that he was present in the audience. He didn't realize that he was being held hostage. And so that is extremely frustrating because Hersh Goldberg Poland has become a household name in millions of American homes, both Jewish and non-Jewish. He is a real symbol, and his parents, Rachel and John, are symbols of the efforts of the families who are trying to get their family members released. And so, the president not talking about Hersh every single day, like we saw with the Iran crisis on every TV station. I mean, I hold everyone accountable on this. Like every TV station, and Glenn Beck does this, on the bottom corner had the number of days where hostages were being held in Tehran. We're not doing that. We don't have yellow ribbons outside of our houses nationwide. Hersh is not a household name. Heath is not a household name. Omer is not a household name. Alexander Idan. There are and then there's two little redheaded children, Kifar and Ariel Bibas, a little boy who just turned 5 2 days ago, and then a 1.5-year-old who has spent the vast majority of his life being held captive. All of these names should be known around the world, and they're not. And I hold the Biden administration partially accountable for that.
Why do you think that, we had Brittany Griner's name up multiple times over the course of her captivity in Russia, and we've gladly seen the return of some of these hostages. Paul Whelan, who was in Russia in prison for 5 years. People knew some of these names more than they know these names that you've just listed, who, again, in a number of instances, are American citizens. Why is it that we are not more familiar and we are not doing more to call out for their release?
There's a saying that kind of became popular among Jews in the wake of all the conversations about the sexual violence that occurred on October 7th. Me too, unless you're a Jew. And it feels like that. UNICEF did not mark the birthday of Ariel Bibas. His birthday was earlier this week. He turned 5 years old, and his mother carried him from their home in Nichoz and Kibbutz, and she physically carried him into Gaza. And there are videos of her being taken holding her 2 babies in absolute abject terror. And her family, I know her family, they're ripping their hair out. Why don't everyone know their names? Why isn't this a story? And what's incredibly frustrating is also that family are also Argentinian citizens. And there's so many of these 115 hostages who are dual citizens of Germany, of the Netherlands, of France, of Argentina, Brazil, you name it. Thailand, there's a lot of Thai hostages. This is a humanitarian worldwide crisis that isn't being treated as such. And it's hard to think of another reason other than the fact that they were taken out of Israeli homes and out of Israeli villages. But it's really, really disheartening and terrifying, honestly, that they are not household names.
I have a couple of questions for you, and I want to ask them in the right order. So, you happen to just say that you're a Republican, that you're a conservative. If we were to have a Democratic Jewish guest, what would you believe they would say about why Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, pro-Israel, spoke openly about, wanting peace in the region, not only for Israel, but also for Gaza and Palestinians? What do you think a Democratic Jewish guest would say on this show?
So I think it depends on who you talk to. And I think also, unfortunately, I'm hearing things privately that I'm not hearing publicly. Privately, I'm hearing a lot of fear that perhaps he wasn't chosen because his last name is Shapiro. Publicly, I think that people want to stand by their candidate. They have an existential fear of Donald Trump becoming president again, and they think this is something that I can't change, and we have to stand by our candidate. And I think that that's a shrewd political move for anyone, especially if you are fearful of the other side. But I'm hearing privately from a lot of folks, I'm disturbed. I'm disturbed that he wasn't chosen. And so, if you had a Democratic guest like pop up and say, "Surprise, I'm here," they would probably defend the choice that was made. But um, I'm not sure why they would be defending that. And I don't hold that against someone for deciding, let's all gather behind the candidate and do the best that we can. We saw that until President Biden stepped down, everyone was publicly saying, he's okay, he's our guy, he's going in November, and then all of a sudden, boom, he stepped down, never said why. And now they're all coalescing around the new candidate. And I think that that's what we're seeing now. They're coalescing around the vice presidential candidate.
This is a good comparison, but do you think that I'm going to read this statement from Governor Shapiro after the news broke that he was not the VP choice. It says, in part, "My life in public service has always been motivated by my family and my faith," something you've pointed out. "Nearly 2 weeks ago, Vice President Harris asked me to work with her team to complete the vetting process to be considered as her running mate. I was grateful to have the opportunity. About the vision for the role ahead, the campaign, Vice President Harris has my enthusiastic support. And I know that Governor Tim Walz is an exceptionally strong addition to the ticket who will help Kamala move our country forward." Do you think that he's walking a fine line where he has to be supportive in public, but privately he too wrestled with some of the comments that were made? Even by members of the media. I remember I was going through either I was channel surfing or I was online and hearing people, pundits, contributors actually saying out of their mouth that Shapiro would be a risky choice, a liability. So do you think that he is, having to kind of have a dual identity as a Jewish politician?
I mean, I think all of us who believe that he was passed over because he was Genocide Josh, that's what they called him. Those were the many, many emails I got from anti Semites who were waging a campaign against him um, among Democrats. I think that it's a scary situation that being a Jew and being an outspoken, and I think that this is the differentiator between him and Bernie Sanders and Doug Emhoff and to some degree Chuck Schumer, is that he is a proud, observant, not necessarily strictly observant, but a proud, observant Jew. And it is a integral part of his identity in a way that it is absolutely not for Doug or for Bernie Sanders or I think for Chuck Schumer anymore. Although that one I'm less sure, but Chuck Schumer is sort of an institution who transcends time. But to be in 2024, it has become a liability. And I think that that's scary as an American Jew, especially when you're seeing the world stay silent when a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old are being held hostage for 10 months. You're thinking, and then I think that this is a sort of an evolutionary thing among Jews. We have this sort of panic button that was pressed too late during World War II of, is this still safe? And I have that tingle sense, and I have a lot of friends who are deciding to move to Israel right now. 2 weeks ago, I had 2 friends move on the same day because they've decided that their tingle Jew sense was getting too loud in America, and that is not the America that I know and love, and I think a lot of Americans are starting to feel that. American Jews are starting to feel that.
Well, and there was a lot of talk right after October 7th that there were some in the Jewish community who felt safer in Israel under a hail of missiles coming from Hezbollah and other militant groups, safer there than they felt here in America. Kamala Harris's husband is Jewish. Do you think that there was some thought within the party that, okay, we've checked that box off, and so we need something else in our arsenal? It had nothing to do with necessarily prejudice or dismissal of Governor Shapiro, but thinking we need to add something else to our to not, I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's almost as though you.
No, I understand. I mean, this is the choice you make when you're choosing a VP. You have to check those boxes of like, this person hits. My question to that would be, what does he check off? He is very vanilla, very boring, very uninteresting. And what I think was interesting about Shapiro, and this is absolutely not the case with Doug Emhoff, who married a non-Jew and whose daughter has fundraised for UNRWA, who were participated in the October 7th massacre. Shapiro brings a love and appreciation of faith that transcends just the Jewish community. He could speak to evangelicals. He could speak to the Rust Belt in a way that's why J.D. Vance was brought on, because he can speak the language of the Rust Belt. And Shapiro can do that much better than Waltz. And also, his state is so much more important than Waltz. If we're just being honest, who had heard of Waltz 7 months ago? I hadn't, and I work in politics. I knew who Josh Shapiro was. He's done really beautiful, incredible work in Philadelphia. Who, as a person who considers herself to be a Republican, although I am a registered Democrat technically, so that I can vote in primaries where I live, I've given him a lot of begrudging respect in a way that I don't with a lot of Democrats. He transcends those political moments in a beautiful, unifying way that very few American politicians of any party can do. And I really thought it was a mistake on the part of the Harris campaign, one that will benefit, I think, the Trump campaign, but I don't think that that's good for America.
In terms of how many Jews you think are divided, part of them wanting to stick with you said you were a registered Democrat still to this day.
So I always have been, because I live in a blue area and I like my vote to count. So I vote in primaries here.
Got it. Okay. So you're a registered Democrat. Do you think that there is some measure of, I don't know, conflicting feeling over this particular election, knowing not only has there continued this conflict where the U.S. has not been able to resolve, this fighting between Israel and Gaza, but also the skyrocketing number of anti-Semitic happenings in this country? I think the Anti-Defamation League shows that anti-Semitism is up 900%. Is there a bit of a conflict in the hearts of Jewish voters about what the right choice is, what the right direction is, and what the right party is in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately everyone thinks that their side is right, or they wouldn't be a Democrat or a Republican. And so I'm hearing, I mean, listen, Trump is not perfect. While he has, a daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is an observant Orthodox Jew and has 3 very observant children as well, he's played footsie with Nick Fuentes, who is a raving maniac anti-Semite. And so all of our parties have issues, but as someone who considers, ideologically to be a Republican and a conservative, what I've found disturbing is that there seems to be much more of a requirement to play nice with an Ilhan Omar, for example, which Tim Walz has praised her repeatedly. They're from the same state. There seems to be much more of a requirement to play nice with those kinds of elements, of those anti-Semitic elements on the left than there is on the right, and not absolving the right of those issues because they exist across the political spectrum. On the far right and the far left, the only thing they agree on is that the Jews are terrible.
Well, since you mentioned that, I want to talk about the tweet that's on your timeline right now, the post that you have on X, which is an article I think you wrote back in 2017 about why we might need to become friends with neo-Nazis. So as soon as you mentioned footsies with Nick Fuentes, I thought, wait a minute, Bethany, like this is part of what you're supporting. You're supporting having conversations with people who you are adamantly opposed to in hopes of, kibutzing into some sense of unified respect for one another. Can you just talk a little bit about that post?
So it's a piece that I wrote in 2017, and then I wrote a follow-up post in 2018 with an equally inflammatory headline, "How the Angry Left Turned Me into a Nazi." And the premise of the piece is not that you should be friends for friends' sake and in a transactional way trying to get what you need from someone, which is, I think, what President Trump did. He tried to cozy up to Nick Fuentes in order to get his support. The premise of my piece was I named 3 individuals who through becoming personally friends with people with abhorrent beliefs, were able to, and this was their objective, was to shift their beliefs away from hate. One of the subjects was Megan Phelps Roper. She was the communications director, if you want to call it that. She was the head person in front of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is the infamous church that pickets outside of military funerals with signs that say God hates fags. This is hate personified. And she was able to be swayed from her hateful beliefs because someone slipped into her DMs on Twitter and said, let's have a conversation. Let's carry on a dialogue. But that person didn't carry on that dialogue with Megan because they wanted to be her friend. They carried on that dialogue with Megan because they wanted her to leave the church, which she ended up doing. And she's become such an incredible advocate for opening hearts and minds and treating people with love and respect in order to bridge the gaps and pull people away from hate. There was another example. I think his name is, I don't remember. He was an African American man who befriends KKK members, and he has swayed hundreds of them away from the KKK because they've held this hatred in their heart against African Americans for so long. But then when you meet one, it's hard to hold hate in your heart for someone who you consider to be a good person and who you consider to be a friend. The third example was a young man named Derek Black. His father was one of the leading neo-Nazis in America, and he was being groomed to be his father's replacement. And he was going to school in Florida, learning German so that he could read Nazi texts in the original German. And Jews on campus invited him to their Sabbath meals. Once everyone on campus realized who he was completely vilified and isolated, and it radicalized him even more. But Jews on campus decided, we're going to have him over for Sabbath meals and we're not going to talk about it. And he was so desperate for that in-person connection because he had been completely isolated on campus that he decided, you know what, I'll take a free meal from the Jews, whatever, screw them. But then over the course of those meals, he became so much more enlightened about the beliefs that he had been holding and that he had been indoctrinated in by his father, that he decided he didn't want to be his father's successor anymore. He didn't want to hold this hate in his heart. And I think the difference, again, between what they did and what President Trump has done was President Trump was, I think, just appeasing Fuentes to get his support in general. He did not go into that meeting thinking, I want to make Nick Fuentes see the error of his ways. I wish that he had. I wish that he had done that with Kanye West too. But I don't think that was Donald Trump's objective. I think it was much more transactional.
Do you think that in light of those two articles that you wrote with those inflammatory headlines and with the context that you just gave us, with the perspective of getting to know each other, do you see a hope for America unifying across party lines, Democrats and Republicans, both who fear each other? Do you see hope for pro-Palestinian protesters and the Jewish students who are blocked from their class? Do you see hope for America where people, including the Jewish community, can feel safe again?
So, I mean, I think it's interesting as an American Jew because I'm seeing my community grapple with this as things become more heated politically. And I'm seeing a lot of people on both sides say, you can't vote for X or Y if you're a good Jew. If you're a good Jew who cares about Jews and if you care about Israel, you can't possibly vote for that candidate. And I'm disturbed by it. But what I think is powerful is that the Jewish community is really trying to police that kind of conversation and saying, let's keep our focus on the hostages. Let's keep our focus on advocating for the release of our hostages, of these Jewish hostages and the American hostages. And I think that we need something that is unifying like that as a nation. And, whether it's like the Olympics, which didn't really seem to be very unifying, we need someone who will come in and be a unifier. And unfortunately, I don't see that in either candidate. I don't see